Hello, everyone. We've got an exciting episode for you today, interviewing Jasper DeWitt. Just a couple of things here. First off, there's some spoilers for The Patient, so if you haven't read that, well, go read it. But they last until about 3 minutes in. And then there's some mild spoilers for his new book, which is not yet published. So if you don't really want any spoilers at all, maybe skip the part where we talk about the flayed man. It's only about a minute, but if you really don't want any spoilers, that's probably what you want to do. And now for our reading. From The Patient by Jasper DeWitt. You don't point out reality to people who have delusions. It doesn't help, and they just get angry.
Welcome, Ruffians, to another episode of the Reading Room Ruffians, your favorite library podcast. I'm skipping our introductions because we are super stoked to have a very special guest on, author of The Patient, which we discussed on our very own episode 14, Irrational Fears and Forgotten Patience, Jasper DeWitt. Jasper, we'd love to offer this time to have you shamelessly plug your socials and yourself.
Well, I don't particularly use social media very much because it's it's a nightmare, and not the good kind that I write about. But you can find me at Jasper DW, and on Facebook, my fan page has the. I'm looking at it right now. Yeah, so I believe it's facebooks.com/please call me Joe. With no E.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
Please call me Joe. No E. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Which, as you probably gathered, was something that I picked before the book came out, when we cut out the final section, which you guys, amusingly, that this was what motivated me to leave the comment. I remember that one of you had listened to Otis Gyri's recording of the Reddit version, and the rest of you had read the actual book.
Yeah.
And I couldn't help sitting there thinking, oh my God, one of them thinks it's a dog, the other one thinks it's his mom. What am I...
That was the most confusing part about that conversation. It was ridiculous.
It was.
Yeah, because none of us had actually talked about the book prior to that. We didn't know.
Yeah, so for the record, the Reddit version is shorter and also has some sections that were left out, particularly the most important one, the ending. The publisher didn't think it made sense for let's call her the antagonist, to out herself at the end of it. And, it's my first book. I didn't know what I was doing. So I said, okay, fine. We left in a lot of clues to what had happened in the final chapter, like the crooked smile. And I was insistent on that because that makes the entire thing that, I won't say it because spoilers, but you know what I mean.
Right.
Yes. The point is that whichever one of you spotted that Jocelyn was the sort of sleeper element in all of that was very smart. Well done.
Yeah, I don't remember who
I think
it
it was Amy.
It might have been.
I think it was Amy.
I think
she's not here
her.
today, but
yeah.
She couldn't join us today. She had some family stuff she had to take care of.
Well, so, all right. Also, hi. You sort of gave me a chance to plug my socials, and I never got a chance to say that. So, yeah.
We are super, super glad to have you on. This has been such a cool thing for all of us. We've just been kind of on cloud nine since we saw your comment.
Yeah,
it's just been is this real?
No,
yeah, we definitely questioned it.
I find a lot of one of your questions, I think, asked about this. So, apologies if I'm skipping ahead in the interview, but there was a period in my life when I read every Goodreads interview and watched every review that people put on YouTube, because it's oh my God, my book has actually got people reading it. People actually care. And of course, it had gone viral on Reddit, so I already was used to that. But, it's different when it's a Reddit story versus when it's an actual book. And so I would, look at and when I saw that someone had done a podcast on my book, I thought, oh my God, someone's done a podcast. So I listened, and immediately, within about 10 minutes, my first thought was, oh no, one of them has read. One of them has heard the Reddit version, and they're going to be so confused. Oh no. So I had to leave a comment to say, look, yes, you well spotted. You have read different versions, but
Oh my gosh.
We really thought she had just lost her mind.
I was so confused with when she was talking. I was like, what are you talking about?
It really felt
Amy?
like the Spider-Man meme where they're all pointing at each other. We were all just kind of like, what do you mean?
Yes. It was like listening to people in different
it was
universes who'd read.
Timeline was jumped.
Yeah.
Yes.
There's a Mandela effect all over again.
Yes.
But it made a really good discussion.
Yeah. Yes, it did. That was such a fun episode.
Although we thought she was crazy for a while.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that added to the story too, though.
Yeah, well, what I will say is that I was very happy to be vindicated that you all preferred the original ending.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I think a few of us have a couple of extra questions too, so like we might surprise you a little bit, and we're very sorry about it.
That's quite all right. And by the way, if we can cut stuff out, I assume.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. It's like, how vague do you want us to be? As vague as possible?
If we talk about anything that is like deeply granular, which I'm totally prepared to do, then I would just ask that we not put it in the actual podcast.
Right.
Okay.
Cool. So we can ask
for me, this is not just a podcast interview. This is also sort of a writing workshop because, as you probably noticed, like this is not the finished version in many ways. There are a lot of typos that I need to fix, for example. But I want to get a sense of, the general vibe of what you guys made of it.
Oh my gosh.
The full manuscript.
I'm ready for a second one. So
well, that's good because I'm hoping that this does become a series.
Yeah, because I when I finished it, I was like, what? I was like, he better be on the second one already. He better be starting it.
Oh, I have plans for the second one. Don't worry. Like everything that happened at the end is something that I've been setting up. And, let's just say that when I first went out to Hollywood in 2019 and started talking about this particular project, one of the people who I did an interview with, who was working with J.J. Abrams, the person who was on the phone at the end, he's who sold her on the entire idea.
Oh,
wow,
that's cool.
Yeah. So not to worry.
Excited.
We have a very look. Let's put it this way. You probably noticed that there's an extent to which this is inspired by Sherlock Holmes, and every good Holmes needs his Moriarty.
Yeah.
Oh,
that's true.
I'm so excited.
All right. Goosebumps. All right. Yeah, that also gave me goosies.
Yeah.
Oh man, this is exciting.
Yeah, I mean, the way I've been pitching it is Sherlock Holmes meets Poltergeist, so that should give you an idea.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it.
Describe it. Yeah, I loved the book. I absolutely loved it.
Good.
I hadn't picked up on the Sherlock Holmes and Watson stuff until you just mentioned it.
Yeah, I mean, so I may as well say that like there are a lot of sources of inspiration for this, and we're probably going to get into a lot of them. But I will say that also I'm attempting to resurrect something which went out of fashion after like the early 20th century, which is the idea of the paranormal investigator, which you can find some great examples of that if you look at like William Hope Hodgson's Carnacki the Ghost Finder. So this is sort of trying to the idea of a Holmes figure who deals with the supernatural is not something that is exclusive to me, but it is something that, I thought, particularly with the advances we have in psychology and with stuff that actually makes sense for a more systematic approach to investigating ghosts, now was the time for it.
That actually kind of relates to like one of the questions that we have. You have so much of the psychology stuff in this book. Do you have a background in psychology?
Yes and no. I've done a lot of therapy, first of all. So, and the thing is that I
feel that.
The patient is actually dedicated to my therapist.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And in fact, so what happened is after a amount of time, he said, look, you clearly understand what you're doing in terms of analyzing yourself, blah, blah, blah. Let me just tell you how this all works. And so I got a lot of explanation of how specific phenomena work. I've done a lot of reading to complement it. My personal favorite of the early psychologists, as you probably noticed from the book, is Carl Jung. I'm going to slip a good deal more of that into the manuscript because, as it happens, I think that I can make some of the clues a bit subtler and make them something that, Stroud himself would pick up on, but maybe Lisa wouldn't. Particularly because the thing is, there are different schools of psychology. And with a ghost, which is just a disembodied mind, you can't really do some of the other ones. You can't do behaviorism. That's not going to work. tell a ghost, well, maybe change the room you haunt. Like, no.
That would be kind of funny to see, though.
Yeah. And you can't give a ghost medication because it's disembodied.
Yeah.
So by definition, what you're left with is psychodynamic therapy, which is talk therapy. And you're also left with image rehearsal therapy, which is a type of therapy that's used on PTSD, where the idea is you tell the person to visualize the way they want their, say, PTSD nightmares to go before they go to bed. And eventually the nightmare changes so that they don't keep having it. There's a way to adjust that for a ghost, obviously, which is you just change the way it's going midway through because you have someone who can control the way the dream goes, which is why Lisa has some of those powers that she has.
Huh.
So, yeah.
I didn't know that about the dream therapy stuff. Like, my therapist told me about my doing certain things for my dreams, and I thought, okay, why not? It never worked.
Yeah, that's too bad. But yeah, I mean, dream interpretation has been a major part of psychology since Freud, and so that is something that obviously plays a huge role with this, because what is a ghost if not just dreams projected onto the physical world in this book?
That's kind of a neat way to look at it too.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't heard it presented like that before, but it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
There is actually a part in this book near the end where they discuss afterlife and stuff like that. And I actually highlighted it and put a heart next to it because I was like, I love this thought process there.
I have really found myself, I've highlighted a lot of the aspects, like the psychological and the kind of scientific thought processes that you have gone through with this book. It has been so interesting to look at, and I've never really looked at it this way.
You're
and
so sciencey.
It makes so much sense, though.
I highlight things and I put smiley faces.
Yeah.
Or I'll write a note
too.
to myself like, "Aw, that's sad," and put a frowny face.
I mean, don't get me wrong. I have too. I have smiley faces and broken hearts and WTFs. But yeah,
I think this sort of brings us into one of our main questions here, which is, how did you come up with the, I guess, the rules, the logic, the dynamic of the ghosts in general, how they function? Because it's not something we've seen before.
The science behind it, of the hauntings.
Yeah.
So this actually gets back to sort of where I got the inspiration for a lot of this concept from. So ghost stories are actually my favorite genre of horror.
Mm-hmm.
And when you first suggested, like, oh, maybe we could discuss a book of your choice, one of the ones that immediately leapt to mind was Ghost Stories of an Antiquary by Montague Rhodes James, which I should mention, Montague Rhodes James is actually the inspiration for Dr. Stroud. Montague Rhodes
I loved him.
Thank God, because he's like...
Yes!
He's like seriously one of my favorite characters. Like, I loved him in this book.
That's a huge relief, because it's been a real dance figuring out how to get him standoffish enough, but also nice enough. So thank God.
Yeah, he's like a grumpy old man, and I'm just like, I just want to hug you.
Yeah,
you're so cute.
Yeah, that's exactly as it should be. So exactly as it should be. So M.R. James was the provost of King's College, Cambridge, and he was a medievalist. And so one of the things that he did with his books was he spent his life mapping medieval libraries and figuring out which books were there, literally going through thousands of books that no one had cataloged before him. And he spoke Latin, Greek. And so he put these very historically accurate touches to his ghost stories that made them deeply scary because it felt like there was veracity to them. And people have speculated that he was gay. He first published his first collection of books because his illustrator, James McBride, who unfortunately died young, people have speculated he was in a relationship with James McBride. And James McBride, he literally only published the book so that he could get his illustrations out there. So the idea of, a curmudgeonly old King's College academic who has James McBride was Irish, but I changed it to Scottish, a Scottish lover who died and left him bereaved was definitely something that inspired the portrayal of this character.
Mm-hmm.
But, okay, so the reason I bring this up is because you asked where I came up with the science. Well, one of the things that I love in a ghost story, because my favorite ghost movies are like The Others with Nicole Kidman, or Mama with, the Muschietti's directed it. I forget the name of the lead actress. And The Ring. And the thing that I always find myself thinking every time I look at one of those movies now is, damn, that ghost needs therapy. Seriously, like, watch any of those, your response will be that ghost needs
You're not
therapy.
wrong.
Yeah.
Like, if you could just get Samara Morgan on the couch and get her to talk about, well, my mom threw me down a well and that kind of, f***ed me up. Like,
As it does.
yes. So and the thing is also, like, when I was little, the stories, whenever I got really scared by something, I would be driven to understand it so that I could, avoid it or figure out what its weaknesses were or whatever. I had a very strategic mind. So when it came to writing about ghosts, my thought was, okay, I want this to be a situation where you don't just have like the stereotypical, oh, spooky ghost and it's been buried wrong and blah, blah. No, I want people to understand how this works, because I don't just want this to be a ghost story. I want this to be the ghost story that explains other ghost stories.
Yeah.
See, I love that.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it doesn't explain all of them, because a lot of ghost stories break the rules into pieces, particularly the part about not leaving the house. But
I like how you added that in there, though, and the explanation you gave for
yeah,
it.
so like the idea of not leaving the house, like there are elements where that can happen. Like, for example, Insidious follows the rules of this because the ghost can possess a child and just follow the kid wherever it goes. But there are other stories that don't quite fit. So the way I came up with it was, I thought, okay, what is it that makes a ghost scary? And what occurred to me was, okay, so you've got this thing that went through something that you don't understand, but this thing, whatever it was so bad that they're still sticking around after death. So obviously, okay, we've got a trauma. That's the first thing we have to deal with. And it's acting that trauma out on the world, on whatever dwelling it occupies or whatever object has been cursed with its presence. It's acting that out. So what we're dealing with, in essence, is someone acting their trauma out on other people, which is a very human thing. People do that in the real world all the time. So my thought process was, if this is going to be something, and this also related to the idea that, okay, how do you get rid of it? Well, if you're dealing with trauma, then there's only one thing you can do: get a therapist. So a psychologist for ghosts was sort of leapt into place from the nature of the entity. I should mention that originally, before I became a published author, this was going to be another thing I wrote on Reddit, but it was going to have Parker as the person who treated the ghost. That changed. And we got Stroud, who he sort of just came to me out of the blue one night while watching this very creepy French Netflix series, which I can't even remember the name of it right now, but it's creepy. Let's put it that way. It was about the ghost of a witch, and the lead protagonist is writing a series of horror stories about that ghost that she grew up with as a problem. And so when I was watching, I thought, a series with the same protagonist. Well, the shrink for ghosts thing actually works really well for that, because a shrink for ghosts, you can have a ghost of the week. It's a procedural. So from there, this is all a very roundabout way of saying that once I figured out that we were dealing with the realm of psychology and what we were dealing with was minds, I just sort of put my thinking cap on and thought, okay, so you've got a mind that's in a house rather than a body. And the house is like the inside of the brain where all of the thoughts happen. So what are some of the rules for how an actual brain works that would apply to the house? And some of the stuff that leapt to mind was, okay, well, you need to have certain parts of the house where bad things happened. That's going to be something that provokes more trauma. So you'd have cold spots there. And you have to have, you can't project, this is obviously in the book, you can't project your own memories out into the world. So by definition, the ghost can't leave the house. And so it was just a matter of like, what are the rules to the human mind that would apply in a different but nevertheless interesting way if it was just you took a mind, you took a psyche, and you stuck it inside of a different object. What would you see in that object? And what I did was basically just, puzzle out, because I have a very systemic kind of brain. I just sort of puzzled out, okay, here's the whole system. Here's how this would work. Here's how that would work. I talked about it with one of my beta readers, and eventually I came up with what you saw. Yeah. So that's how I came up with it.
I love that.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's
So
really fascinating. Yeah.
you mentioned how Parker was going to be
Yes.
the ghost therapist. That's another one of our questions, sort of. In the book, you refer to a Dr. PH speculating
Yeah, you got me.
that, it's a boogeyman. Okay, I read that and instantly laid this book down, went and found the patient in the library and was flipping through pages like crazy trying to find his name.
Yeah, you got me.
And I was like, I think he's referring to this.
Yes. So
I felt like that meme with the guy who's crazy and has all the strings everywhere. That's what I felt like.
No, that's something that I always do in my work. The patient actually has a number of references because it was originally a Reddit story. It has a number of references to other Reddit stories in it that I wrote. And yes, I like to drop hints that all my books take place in the same universe. And so, yes,
I love
Dr.
that.
PH, that's Parker, trying to say, well, maybe it's the same thing I dealt with. And it's like, no, different supernatural creature, dude. Different problem.
Yeah, I love that. She was like, that's crazy.
And that's a little of my self-deprecating humor because oh yeah, who the hell came up with that? That's insane.
I liked it. I was like, but yeah, I definitely felt like that crazy person in that meme.
Talking about those two characters, now I really liked Parker, but I love Stroud.
Oh my gosh, he's a sweet baby.
Yep.
That's wonderful to hear. Truly wonderful.
Definitely a favorite.
And you liked Lisa.
Oh yeah.
Yes. Oh yes, I liked her a lot.
Good. Because one of the things that drove me to have a female protagonist was precisely that there were all these nasty Goodreads reviews on the patient of people saying, well, the female characters are terribly written. And I thought, well, challenge accepted. I'll just write a female protagonist next time.
I love it. I really liked her. I like how she used not only her empathy and compassion for these children, but also this anger that she gets.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I support feminine rage.
Yes.
I do.
Yeah.
And I was like, I love that she uses that and is able to use it in this book that way.
Yeah, no, Lisa as a character was also one who was hard to pick because it was also a matter of figuring out that sort of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, this version is too nice, this version is too angry, this version is just right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she's so intelligent too. I mean,
She
it's
is.
Yeah, I love that.
She's
Yeah.
smart and she's quick.
Yeah. And I really liked watching her struggle. She just rationalized everything away. And, you're going into a book about a terrifying house that's probably murdering people. And you're like, oh my God, this is a horror movie. And she's just not even aware.
Yeah.
Watching the light bulb is just
I enjoyed her trauma, the trauma that she had and how she was able to get through that.
Yeah.
That was really good to watch or read, I guess. I said watch
You
because
watch
I just
it in your head.
play it as a movie in my head.
Well, so do I when I write. I play I have the camera angles in my head of how all of this goes. So yes, I'm glad that came across. Lisa's trauma was also something that went through a number of different iterations. But this version, I think, what I like about this version is just the sheer randomness of it.
Yeah.
Because, and I will say that I actually, one of my friends who is partial inspiration for her, although not entirely, one of my friends who is a poor kid from Philadelphia who went to Yale, not Princeton, she told me about what it was like growing up in that environment and told me even where she lived. So I went and looked at Google Maps and figured out exactly where Kaplan's pawnbrokers would be. And even looked at the Google Street View so I could describe, what the intersections were.
That.
Yeah.
I guess, what is your writing process like?
Slow until it's not.
I love that.
It's very systematic. I think of my job almost more like an engineer than like an artist. Because I'm trying to, one of the most important things, particularly with the kinds of stories I write, which you probably noticed, they're all very mystery adjacent. Yeah. One of the things that I really focus on is something that I and a beta reader came up with. It's called exposition choreography, which is figuring out where you put particular clues so that the audience can figure out what's going on, where, etc.
Yeah.
You did really well with this one because I read a lot of horror books and I like stuff like that. And I was guessing through this entire book, like me and Carla, we texted each other back and forth because we were right around within 20 pages of each other all the time. And I was like, I think it's this. And she'd be like, well, I think it's this. And then like through the whole thing, we were guessing. So you did really well with that.
There was a few times I was so thrown off that I didn't have a clue.
That answers the biggest question I had for you guys, which is, was it too obvious?
No. Like I had an idea around, what was it, page 235. And then I altered that idea around 250. And it ended up being the correct idea, but I was not sure.
Good. I will say that that's very relieving. Like, honestly, you guys are reacting exactly the way I would have hoped to the really hard stuff in the book. So that's a huge relief. And there is one question that you had that I do want to touch on, because it's actually just something I enjoy talking about, which is you said the locations are really well drawn.
Yes.
So the locations, I have a very strong philosophy that when it comes to locations, you write what you know. So Silent Cove is just, the name's been changed, but it's basically where I grew up, which Silent Cove is actually, if you want to visit the original place, you can go to a place called Pacific Grove in California. I grew up in the Monterey area. And Seaborough, which is where Stroud has his house, is Big Sur. And if you know anything about Big Sur, it's exactly the kind of place where a wealthy, eccentric therapist for ghosts would hole up. I loved your little noise there,
Zach.
It was like,
Yeah.
No, that makes a ton of sense, honestly.
Yeah.
Okay.
And so, but New Valhalla, so you asked if it was based on a real haunted house. New Valhalla is like a pastiche of multiple different places that are sort of in that in that region. So the Winchester Mystery House is the big one, which you will see freaking billboards for all over Monterey. Hearst Castle is another, which is not haunted as far as I know, but that sort of grand, opulent home of, privilege was something, and some of the tackiness too was something that I put in from Hearst Castle. And then my godmother has this gorgeous house that's way up on the cliffs in Big Sur that overlooks the ocean. And if it was just a little bit further out, you could see it falling into the ocean. So a lot of that was sort of the milieu of it. But when it came to the other thing I will say is that, and this is something that I really am happy that I seem to be the first person to have figured out. If you visit California and you go into any drugstore, you'll see a rack of little books with like ghosts of whatever the location is. Like, I was surprised when I went into a pharmacy here in LA, I found Ghosts of Los Angeles. And when you go into a pharmacy in Monterey County, you'll find Ghosts of Monterey County, and there's like an entire series of them. So Byron Markham's book, Hauntings of Silent Cove, is actually something that's very much drawn from the life. The only difference is it's someone who actually lived there. And I am just surprised that no one except for me seems to have figured out that there's this rich folklore of hauntings in California that seemingly no one, everybody has to set their, and I say this having set my first book in Connecticut, everyone has to set their stories on the East Coast. And it's like, there's this, well, you are. I mean, I went to college in Connecticut. I know what it's like. It's definitely got the Gothic architecture and the, creepy dark winters. And so I get that the vibe is much more friendly to horror than, palm trees and sun. But if you drive up north into Northern California and look around, it's really this wild, untamed sort of location with a lot of towns that would be indistinguishable from a rural fishing village in like England or even New England. And so that's what Pacific Grove is like. That's what the real Silent Cove is like.
Oh.
Although Silent Cove is sort of a mixture of Pacific Grove and Monterey, because Lisa works in what would be downtown Monterey. And the hospital is literally like, I literally drove out to the hospital and was like, okay, there's a bunch of redwoods around it. Let's have her park in the shadow of one of those.
Okay, so while we're on like writing about, I guess, Byron's story, what was it like writing a book inside a book?
Oh boy. So really there's two books inside this book. There's Byron and then there's Alice's journal.
Yeah, that's very
true. So the thing about Byron is, in a previous draft, Stroud mentioned that the problem with Byron's book is there's too many split infinitives. So that sort of affected how I wrote him, because when I sat down and started actually trying to write and put as many split infinitives in as possible, what came out was this very sort of half-educated, trying to sound super educated style. And I just fell in love with it because, oh my God, like he's trying to sound like this, gothic ghost story writer, and he's not quite pulling it off. One of the things that was a lot of fun was figuring out, okay, so most of this is going to be true, but I need to have like some obscenely ridiculous, like B-movie type effect that happens in this.
Yeah.
And you know what that is by now, obviously.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
Yes. And then a skeleton in a wedding dress popped
B-movie is
out.
like
It's
almost
like,
exactly
for
what I
God's
thought
sake.
when I read that little section of his book. I was like, oh man, that's corny.
Yeah. And it shouldn't, because it's not real. So yeah, the idea of, something in here that would make someone immediately put it down in disgust and be like, this is BS.
Yeah.
That had to be in there. But really, it was also an excuse to do something which I really enjoyed doing, which is to write sort of a first person, like imitation Gothic account of what happened in New Valhalla, which I thought also, similar to how the files in The Patient, which he read on Joe, gave you this sort of image of what Joe was like. The vibe of New Valhalla, despite that ridiculous section, I think gets really captured with that. So it was nice to be able to write a, Gothic style ghost story and then have the rest of the book be, okay, now let's figure out what caused all of this.
Yeah.
That is so fun. Once I got to that, I was like, I've read a couple of books like this before, and I just always found it very interesting how like writing, like the historian has basically, it's a girl telling about her childhood, and then she found her dad's journal, and then inside of that was his mentor's journal.
Yeah.
And it was wild to go through, but I hadn't read another one like that since. So this came and I was like, I get to ask somebody.
I liked Alice's journal in there a lot. I like how you could
like the way she
see where
spoke
she
to
was like struggling so much, and
Yeah.
then the whole like, just let it end. Just let it end. You know?
I like the way she spoke to it like a person,
Yeah.
Yeah.
which was interesting.
Yeah, it really was.
Well, yeah, it's one of those things she couldn't really. Okay, I don't want to get into too many details here, but she couldn't really confide in anybody else, at least for the most part, because, like, Edgar was gone, right, the whole time. And she's just there with what. I can't remember what the maid's name or handmaid's name is. Anyway, she had, like, nobody to talk to effectively, so diary was really her outlet there. And that really came through as her treating it like a person. Also, my God, she was so eloquent when she was like writing in the journal. It was great. It was completely different. Actually, this is a thing. It was a completely different vibe from the rest of the book.
It was written really well.
Yeah.
I don't know. It just completely like felt like a different entire chunk, which I was impressed with when I was reading it. Yeah.
Yeah. So Alice, I would mention about her that, so her story is very much a love letter to the Brontes. And so I was trying to go for like a Jane Eyre / Wuthering Heights type style with the way that she writes.
I can definitely see that.
Yeah. And the thing about, I like that you noticed that she is eloquent, because the thing that's really, like, I feel really bad for Alice because she is really smart and like nothing gets past her. And I almost don't like calling her an antagonist because she's not really, like, it's not like it's her fault any of this happened. It's the freaking awful orphanage keeper's fault that this all happened. Which she is just one of the most horrific characters I've ever written, and she's barely in it.
Yeah. What got you into writing like horror and thrillers specifically?
Yes. So what got me into writing, ironically, was D&D.
I love D&D.
Yes.
We're a couple D&D players here, so.
Oh, good. Well, in that case, what I may as well tell you is I was living in Washington, D.C. when I wrote The Patient. And what prompted me to start writing fiction at all was the fact that my players in my D&D campaigns said, Jasper, you're always talking about all of these horror stories that you read that you're using as inspiration for our adventures. Write your own stuff.
Yeah.
And because we know you're a good storyteller, we've lived through your stories for, years now. write some of your own stuff. So I sat down, and you see what the result was. So when I did D&D, there are sort of two styles I like to work with. And one of them, I do have a fantasy novel in my trunk, which I've tried to sell, but I think we need to get a couple more horror novels out before the world's ready for that. Because it's a big genre shift, and it's a big book. But I would either do like very dark fantasy of the like Game of Thrones / Dark Souls variety, or I would do Ravenloft games, which, if you know D&D lore, Ravenloft is the famous like Hammer horror by way of Wizards of the Coast gothic horror setting.
Yeah.
And in the 3rd edition of the Ravenloft campaign setting, which I bought back when I was in high school, there was a list of recommended books for inspiration. And I got my hands on as many of them as I could and read through all of them. And it just kindled, because the thing is, those stories, I was a very nervous kid for much of my childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Those stories scared the crap out of me. Literally. And the thing is, this is also why therapists are the hero in all my because what happened was, what I soon discovered was, once I told my therapist about 1 or 2 of these stories that was keeping me up at night, he immediately went, "Oh, I know why that scares you." And he explained like why I'd be able to relate to certain things in the story that felt like something that had happened to me, and how that actually was pointing at deeper trauma. And so at that point, what I suddenly realized was, wait, finding things that scare me is a way of self-improvement. Story.
Stop looking
Can't
at me.
relate.
Stop looking at me like
I
that.
was really looking at me for me. Because I cannot relate. I run from it.
No,
I dig deeper into it.
I run toward the fire. The first story, which ironically I would say that if you read this, you would see its fingerprints all over Sleep of Death. The first story that really did this for me was a story called The Loony, from the British author Alison Prince, who was known for children's books, but this was one of her ghost stories that made it into an anthology for teenagers called The Young Oxford Book of Nasty Endings.
Huh.
And
That's a fantastic title.
Yeah, as you can probably gather from the name, Nasty Endings, this thing is bleak as all. And frankly, like, it wasn't just anthologized there. It was also anthologized by Ramsey Campbell in a grown-up book for adults, because it's just that dark. And when I listen to it now, you can find recordings of it on YouTube. When I listen to it now, I just find myself thinking, wow, how did this make it into a book for teenagers? This is dark. And there's a bit of like, there's even a bit of a reference to it in Sleep of Death, when Alice comes downstairs and sees Edgar being, stitched up by Dr. Hardy. That scene is taken from The Loony as a little bit of an Easter egg. There are a lot of those in the book, frankly. You can find references to all sorts of stories in there as a sort of, joke for those who know. The thing that really scared me about that story, and which has stuck with me through to the rest of it, is that it's a story essentially about ghosts gaslighting someone into becoming insane. And the way that the ghosts were described really resonated with stuff that I'd been through as a kid, because I had a very emotionally abusive father.
I was going to say, that sounds very human,
Yeah.
gaslighting someone into being insane.
Yes,
Yeah.
that exactly. And so, when I look at what got me into horror specifically, was that I was doing all of it in D&D already. And I was also, obsessively trying to find anything that could scare me, because, as you might imagine, I very quickly developed a extremely sharp carapace when it came to dealing with scary things. Like, nothing scares me now.
Yeah.
I was actually deeply impressed when I discovered that actually Junji Ito still had the power to give me nightmares.
Okay, no, Junji Ito is, that's some messed up stuff. I'm not going to lie. It freaks me out sometimes.
Yeah, no, the thing is that Junji Ito, like, his stories are ridiculous if you read the plot summaries, but when you see the art, it's
that's
like a nightmare.
That's the thing that gets you. Oh, it's terrifying. The first time I ever read anything by Junji Ito, Junji Ito, I was like, reading the story is something, but then seeing the artwork that goes along with it it gave me nightmares. It really did.
Yes.
I can't do it.
I need to read one of these. I know Jordan was talking about them.
Yeah.
And showed me some of the art, and I was like, whoa, that's neat. It's gross, but I love it.
He's obsessed.
Right?
Yeah.
And hearing that Zach had nightmares, I need to read it and I'll tell him how much of a wimp he is.
Yeah, well, good luck.
I don't know. I read a lot of really messed up stuff.
It doesn't hit you when you're reading it. It hits you later.
I write messed up stuff, and yeah, what he said.
Yeah, that's so funny. I guess really the last thing that we have in our written down list of questions is, do you have really fleshed out an amazing ghost story here and it still feels really real, like lived experience? Do you have any of your own lived experiences with any of the paranormal or anything like that?
I wish I had something really interesting and cool to say, I went upstairs one night and saw a figure standing at the... No. Unfortunately, I don't have anything quite that substantial.
Yeah.
What I will say is that for me, the reason why I think it feels so fun, it's because I've read a lot of people do that. And I realize that making something feel like it's drawn from the life is part of what makes horror work, because you feel like there's no fourth wall. But the other thing is, in my view, horror is most effective when it's a metaphorical language. So, The Patient is actually not about, it's about what it's about, obviously, but when you actually look at what inspired it, it's actually about the power of self-loathing. Because Joe, the idea of something that becomes whatever you tell it that it is, but only if it's bad, that is very much how self-loathing works.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to show the world was, okay, this is what it's like to struggle with that inside you. With Joe inside you, constantly making you believe you are whatever horrible thing someone says about you. The thing about horror is that because it's so heightened, and the reality is, heightened reality, it's so dark, you can take things that are real struggles and you can put them into the real world in the form of a monster or a ghost or what have you.
Yeah.
Taking Alice, for example, that's grief. The entire story is about grief. And the idea of...
Yeah, I felt so bad.
And the idea of having people's psychological traumas, dramatized in a house means you can take all of the terror of what it's like to deal with that trauma and you can give it physical form. And so if it feels real, it's because it is a real thing that you're reading about. It's just disguised as something supernatural.
Yeah. That's awesome.
No, that makes sense. It's effectively putting the human experience into more of a, I guess, physical form in the form of ghosts in this case.
Yeah, in the case of ghosts or boogeyman or what have you. And I will say, though, since you asked about supernatural experiences, the only thing I can really point to that is genuinely creepy is whenever I was a kid and I would sit down at the piano, because we had a piano in our house, I would always get this eerie feeling like there were eyes on the back watching me from the back of my neck. And I would always turn around. There was nothing there, but it was always like something malevolent was standing right behind me, looking down at me. And
that's terrifying. Was it an old piano? Did y'all get it from somebody else?
So my mother had it. I don't know what the pedigree of the piano is, but for all I know, it might have been.
So maybe it was their piano and they did not like kids.
Yeah, that might have been it. That might very well have been it.
Yeah, creepy old stuff. It'll get you sometimes. Yeah. It really will.
Yeah.
We need to get him in touch with who's our paranormal investigator friend?
Danny.
That's right. Danny Phantom here.
Yeah. We actually have a podcast episode where we discuss all the creepy stuff that's happened to us.
Oh, wonderful.
Paranormal stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we can email you which episode that is, because I have no clue. I can tell you.
We've done a couple of them so far, yeah.
But it's with
Danny.
We discuss it with Danny. So
Well, that sounds like it could be something that I could steal a lot of stories from. So great.
There you go. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, no, totally. He does a bunch of investigations in, what is his...
Spirit Walk
YouTube?
Paranormal.
Yeah, Spirit Walk Paranormal. If you want to check him out, it's pretty decent. Very high quality investigation.
Yeah, he does
stuff.
very, very well.
Yes,
yeah.
I mean, they're amazing.
We discuss
I'm not a
aliens and
believer in
ghosts and all kinds of stuff with him.
That would be very good.
I'm not a believer in ghosts. His stuff is fantastic. It really is. But yeah, that was one thing. So one question I had, in this book, there's a lot of discussion of ghosts manifesting in ways that are metaphorical to how they actually feel. Is this something that you have thought of, like, as ghosts being more metaphorical in their, I guess, presentation, or is this something that you're getting from somewhere else? Or I guess where does it come from?
So where it comes from is that since we're dealing with human minds, the most terrifying part of the human mind is what's called the unconscious mind. And the unconscious mind doesn't operate according to strict rules of logic. It operates according to how things feel. And it doesn't even really necessarily recognize time. You know, what happened one day is still happening in the unconscious mind to this day. So the way that I thought of the way that ghosts would manifest is, again, they're dreams, basically. The hauntings you see in a house are dreams being made real. So when you go into a dream, it's not like someone sits you down and like you see exactly, sometimes you like see an exact event you want to take place, or you dream about, you know, whatever. But often it's like, well, I woke up and then my socks came alive and then they twined themselves around my neck and tried to strangle me and then they turned into snakes. And like, okay, clearly we're dealing with a language that is emotional, but which is not literal.
Yeah, I was told once that the dreams that you have when you have PTSD, they can manifest in a way that it doesn't make any sense, but it's just the feelings your body is reenacting and not necessarily the events.
Right, yes. So what I'm trying to do is with the metaphorical like images of like, oh, the Scarlet Man looks like he's been flayed. Well, that makes sense. He has no body. He has no skin. You know, he feels completely exposed to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
And with regard to like the heart being missing, well, you know, you've read the book. You know what that actually symbolizes.
Yeah.
It's because what their minds are trying to do is find a way to process the injury that has been done to them in a way that makes physical sense.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like an externalization of what the feeling is.
Yes, it's like, this is how it feels for my mind, so let me show you how it would look if it was on my body.
Yeah, totally makes sense. But it's a very interesting way of portraying these things. And
I love it. I
really do.
I wish that we could actually do that.
Yeah.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, it
Not
would.
me.
Well, it might hurt because, you know, you might rip your own heart out.
Well, you know.
I mean, it gets the point across.
It does. It does get the
so
point
that's
across.
all that matters.
Yeah. I'm dramatic like that.
Okay, so I guess my personal last question is, so you talk a lot about, okay, so obviously you said during this interview, therapists are like the heroes in your stories.
Yes.
Is part of the reason, I mean, obviously there is some influence from your therapist and your therapy sessions and all that, but are you trying to impart to some degree like the importance of understanding mental illness and therapy itself with your books?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Or is this just like a side thing?
No, okay. I think, look, my general thinking is that pretty much everything we see in modern society is downstream from psychology. And the way that I think that people should be approaching, well, it's actually funny because like when you look at how people act or how things happen in politics or culture or anything like that, it's usually an expression of something. And it's like, okay, we have the source code to the human mind and people aren't bothering to learn about it. What? So my general goal is both to communicate, yes, the importance of therapy, the importance of mental health, but also to communicate the power of knowing how all of this works, to create this sense that no, human beings are not these inscrutable other objects that we can never fully understand. Like, no, we have the tools to understand other people. We have the mechanisms by which we can, you know, if not enhance our empathy, then imitate it if we have problems with empathy. This is a way for us to understand each other. And, you know, if I have to show people the way that you do the way you do that by having it applied to perhaps the most terrifying things they can imagine. You know, look, psychology works even on ghosts. Psychology works even on boogeymen, for example. But more to the point, also, I would say that like and this gets to something else about why Stroud is a psychologist. If I were writing this in like 1900, he'd be a priest. And that's not because there was some like extra power to religion back then. It's because, well, who did people go to talk to about their pain, their troubles, to confess their sins? Would have been a priest. And in fact, there's like, I didn't put this in the book, but there's like an idea that if a ghost was Catholic, a priest would work on it because placebo effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But since we don't have an idea of, we don't have that unifying religious mythology anymore as a society. But what we do still have is we do still all have human minds. And so what makes sense now is to take what is sort of our modern day equivalent of the priest class, which is psychologists, analysts, and to show like this is what we've, whether we recognize it or not, because we haven't learned the theology of psychology, whether we recognize it or not, this is what we've oriented our society around. And we need to recognize the source of power that this gives us and the amount that the rules of this science have power over us. So if any of that made sense, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do to some extent. I mean, I'm not trying to be like an infomercial for psychology, but like I am trying to scare people. That's obviously the goal here, but there is also a sense in which like if I think, okay, who has been most responsible for chasing away the demons in my life? It's my therapist. So
yeah,
the heroes of my stories are people who know how to do that. And the only people I can think of who really know how to do that are psychologists.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah.
I think it's
No,
neat
I
that
think
they're
it's a good
being
message.
portrayed in a heroic aspect because a lot of times they're not.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think I'd also like to inspire some people to, pursue that if they wanted to. Because the fact of the matter is, as you probably gathered from Lisa and Stroud, there's sort of this wistfulness to the book, which is, these two are the exception. There aren't enough Lisas in the world. There aren't enough Strouds in the world. And this is different from the patient where, you probably picked up, even though he's a likable character, that I, as the author, have something of a, simmering contempt for Parker for being so naive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, like, if Parker is the bad version of that, the hubristic version, then Lisa and Stroud are like, this is what we want our social workers and our psychologists and, the people whose job it is to heal to be like.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
All right. We have 5 minutes left. Do we have any other final questions or anything? Yeah.
Okay, I just want to thank you for like The Patient because that's the first horror book I have ever read. And I avoided it because I grew up in a family that
She's a chicken.
Yeah, I am. Well, I mean, if you grew up with all the weird stuff that I did, I mean, that was pretty commonplace in a holler in West Virginia.
Yeah.
To have those stories and those experiences. So I was like, no, I'm not going there. But The Patient is what opened my eyes to it, and I enjoyed it, even though it was disturbing.
Yeah.
And this one I love, and I cannot wait to get the rest of the series on this one.
My question is, when you get a second one, can you email us a copy?
Well, God willing, I get the first one published. But look,
anxiously waiting. You don't even have to publish the first one. Just write the second one. I'll read it.
Do let us know when it comes out, though.
Of course,
absolutely.
Yeah.
We want to get copies.
If you want to turn off the recorder, I'm happy to give you a little bit of extra detail about what's to come.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Let me see. I will stop recording.